Hello, HashiConf. A little over 18 months ago, we launched Boundary to create a standardized workflow for securing and managing access to your infrastructure wherever it resides. Today, we're excited to talk about the beta launch of HCP Boundary, a managed service offering on the HashiCorp cloud platform that's the easiest way to automate how your development and DevOps teams access their infrastructure. My name is Pete Payson, and I lead Boundary's product management team. With me today is HCP Boundary Senior Software Engineer Lili, who will walk you through some of HCP Boundary's capabilities and give you a look at how it can help your technical teams manage access to their cloud infrastructure. To start, though, let's talk about why we're building Boundary. And the answer to why we're building Boundary is that traditional access workflows break down in a cloud operating model. In that traditional access model, those traditional tools like VPNs and firewalls were designed around castle and moat or network perimeter-based security paradigms. In that world, the focus is on strengthening the defenses of the network on which your most sensitive infrastructure resources reside. That emphasizes network location as the control point of security. Typically, as a user, you're either on those networks and have access to everything, or off of those networks, and it really lacks granular controls once you're on that network. Now that model of hard networks and soft interiors starts to break down in kind of a cloud operating model where you have a distributed remote world. You've got cloud resources that are distributed across data centers and infrastructure providers, and clients are connecting from anywhere. Now, in that model, network location becomes too brittle to serve as a control access point because clients and servers are having those network locations constantly change. Zero trust security architectures have emerged to start to address these challenges by instead authenticating clients based off of their logical identity rather than their network location, and continuously authorizing transactions for any kind of access attempt. Now, this helps secure modern cloud-native environments where network location is ephemeral and you need to base that off of the identity in question. A huge problem with moving to a zero trust security paradigm, though, is the complexity of doing so at scale. Modern development teams need to work across this matrix of different cloud providers and securely access infrastructure that's constantly changing and being redeployed. So organizations need a standardized way to automate how these identity-based security controls are managed and enforced. Now, HashiCorp as a vendor provides common workflows for automating these zero trust security controls for the different types of access that organizations might have. Now, just in the same way that Terraform defines a common workflow for provisioning infrastructure across providers, or Vault defines a workflow for managing secrets across provider, or even Consul defines a workflow for identity-based network access across providers, Boundary really completes this picture as a workflow for human-based access to their infrastructure resource. This simplifies the access workflow for your developers, DevOps engineers, and database analysts who just need to access their end systems to do their jobs. They can't get bogged down in those cumbersome kind of connection processes. Now, the Boundary workflow presents users with a common way to perform this access. Administrators can authenticate their users using their identity provider of choice, receive granular permissions that govern explicitly what systems they can connect to and what actions they can take against those systems. And where Boundary really differentiates itself is in automation workflows for the onboarding of new target hosts and the configuration of security policies against those hosts. This can be most aptly seen in Boundary's dynamic host catalogs, which are basically a pluggable way for Boundary to query external infrastructure providers and service registries to automate the onboarding and configuration of newly deployed services from their infrastructure providers' subscriptions. And lastly, once you've gone through this process of authenticating your identity, authorizing what they have access to, and then establishing a route to that end system, Boundary actually grants that access on a just-in-time least privileged basis, so that the actual network connectivity that the user has to that end target is granted on a time-limited basis. And then even the credential used for that access can be granted on a single-use basis if Boundary is used in combination with a secrets management platform like HashiCorp Vault. Now, this workflow has matured quite a bit over the last 18 months. We've seen Boundary get downloaded by millions of people across the globe, and we've started to see adoption across thousands of different users at some of the largest companies in the world. And today, we're really excited to make these Boundary workflows available as a cloud service by launching the HCP Boundary beta. HCP Boundaries beta offers a simple one-click deployment for getting up and started with your Boundary environment. And this is the easiest way to get started and establish that access workflow for how your developers, DevOps engineers, and business analysts access their infrastructure. And lastly, as an administrator, you can simplify the complexity of managing access at scale with Boundary's automated workflows for both onboarding identities and target hosts and configuring their access permissions as they come on and off of your corporate environments. Now, to talk more about HCP Boundary's capabilities and provide a walkthrough of the beta, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Lili.
As Pete mentioned, we're announcing the fully managed Boundary offering on HashiCorp Cloud with all the capabilities you'll find in the open source version plus more. Today, anyone can get started with HCP Boundary on HashiCorp Cloud and deploy a beta instance. While we don't have production SLAs yet, all instances will be upgradable to future GA versions. That way you don't have to worry about throwing away all your configuration work. HCP Boundary will also have a flexible worker topology where you'll have the option of HashiCorp to manage your workers, or you can host them yourself. And more on that in a second. First, let's review the Boundary access model. As we mentioned, Boundary is a smart identity-aware proxy. It sits in the infrastructure between users and target systems they want to connect to. Boundary has two concepts, the controllers and workers. The controller manages all the state around targets, users, as well as access policies and what external providers Boundary can connect to. So it consists of an underlying relational database in Archives Postgres and a state of stateless controllers that serve the Boundary API. A user authenticates to that controller, and when the user goes to connect to the end target, the controller assigns that session to a worker node, which is just a stateless proxy that needs to have network access to targets under management. That worker is a TCP-based proxy and can run anything that runs on top of TCP, for example, SSH, RDP, or database connections. So, which in turn means that Boundary can manage access to all those type of sessions. The session is presented to the user as a TCP tunnel. It's wrapped in mutual TLS, so no one can man in the middle. If you're connecting over SSH through Boundary tunnel, you have two layers of encryption, the SSH session that the user creates, as well as the underlying transport layer security that Boundary creates. And as we mentioned before, Boundary has the concept of a worker. And with HCP Managed Boundary, you have the choice to use the self-managed workers, which are available out of the box with HCP Boundary. This is where Boundary controllers and workers are managed by HashiCorp for you. It does require you to expose your targets to the public. But with HCP Boundary Beta, we're introducing the ability to bring your own worker, which won't require you to expose the targets, but we still manage the controllers for you. And we also offer all the extra features coming up to HCP Boundary. So now let's have a look at HCP Boundary in action. For our demo, we have the Northwind product line. Recently, we had 4 new data analysts join our company, and they will need access to sales data on Azure SQL Server in order to generate business dashboards for campaign planning. In this demo, I will take the role of Boundary administrator who wants to configure role-based access to the SQL Server for the data analyst in a way that doesn't expose the underlying network or credentials for the database. We want to implement least privilege for data analysts and have an easy way to revoke access if needed. The solution that we'll show today is to provision HCP Boundary to delegate authentication to Azure AD for SSO and to Boundary. Use Vault to broker credentials for Boundary for the database, and establish a secure connection to database for the users with Boundary as a proxy. First, let's create our Boundary environment, which I'll do in the HCP portal. Here I can deploy my environment after giving basic details about my environment, a name and an initial administrative account, with which I can bootstrap the environment. Now we can see our cluster is spinning up, and the new Boundary cluster will be provisioned within a minute with the credentials that we provided above. Now that my environment is deployed, I need a way to automate the configuration of my environment and the onboarding of new entities and targets. As an administrator, I can streamline this configuration by using Boundary's Terraform provider, which can be used to deploy Boundary and establish admin authentication. We can configure the user authentication method for SSO into Boundary, allow Boundary to connect to Vault and retrieve secrets for targets, and onboard users and targets. So we can see here I've used Terraform to write configuration to set up a project for the Northwinds product line, configure the authentication with my Azure Active Directory tenant via OIDC, onboard the new data analyst users to Boundary, and assign permissions based on their role. Also add the Azure SQL database to the Northwinds project as a target host to authorize access for data analysts. And finally, we configure a credential store and credential library for my Vault environment so that Boundary can retrieve credentials for database and serve as a proxy between data analysts and the Azure SQL server. Let's see what that looks like in Boundary from a point of view of an administrator. First, we have a global scope for our Boundary deployment. Scopes are a fundamental part of Boundary that model permission boundaries as a container. Within our global scope, we have organizational scopes that enable us to partition resources, such as a group of users and their associated roles, in our case, data analysts. Within this scope, we have created a project for Northwinds product line for the data analysts and have onboarded targets like the Azure SQL database. This target can be used to create authorized sessions to any of the resources in its host set. One of the key differentiating features of HCP Boundary that we discussed previously are dynamic host catalogs. Our deployment integrates with Azure to onboard resources from my Azure subscription to our Boundary host set based on the host set filters. This ensures any newly created and deployed Azure resources are dynamically added to my target, and this automation is critical for scaling secure remote access in ephemeral environments. The Vault credential library that the target is configured will return credentials back to the user at the time the session is created. And most importantly, these credentials are revoked when the session is terminated. This covers many of the fundamentals of the secure remote access workflow for HCP Boundary. Now let's switch gears back to the end user experience for the data analysts. As an analyst, I'm on my second week at this new job, and instead of opening a ticket to get VPN access or waiting for my user credentials to be added to a PAM solution, for example, I can just simply log into Boundary immediately using SSO with Azure Active Directory. And I open the Boundary desktop application and I log in. From here, I'm able to see the targets that I'm authorized to access. In this instance, I'm authorized to access to a Postgres database on Azure that stores the sales data. I click Connect, and a secure session has been established so that now I can access the Postgres database.
So let's talk about what's next for Boundary. Developing HCP Boundary is going to be a core focus of the team in the upcoming quarters. You can expect some new use cases and features to become available on HCP Boundary that extend Boundary's open source capabilities. You can also expect integrated single sign-on to HCP Boundary using your HCP platform identity. And lastly, you can expect even deeper integrations with Vault Enterprise and HCP Vault environments that exist on private networks. And with all of that said, we so appreciate your interest in taking time to learn about HCP Boundary. You can try out HCP Boundary today for free on the links on the screen. And we're excited to hear what you think. Thanks so much.